I suppose we start with a short note of, overall subject of today. Worldwide impact of the pandemic is known to everybody, I guess. In the MENA region, the pandemic, like elsewhere, caused series of challenges, not only in the sector and the economic and health sector, but also the social contract. I'm talking about the state-society relations, and of course, the dynamic of peace and conflict in the region. In general, there is little ink has been spilled on this, the impact of the pandemic in the MENA region. That little literature in itself focused primarily on, the state's responses to the pandemic. But in doing so, we again mistakenly use the state as the only unit of analysis when we describe the politics or peace and conflict in the Middle East. But is this really the case? If we buy Weber or Ibn Khaldun, who was this Arab philosopher lived in Spain at the time of Moors, if we buy their notion of the state, and that is, the state is established when patrimonialism finishes, right? Then this by default means that when the state collapses, those local actors or local identities, sub-identities will re-emerge and exercise as some sort of rule of the states in the areas where the state's power is absent. So a quick look at the status or the state of the Arab states. The wave of the Arab uprising in 2011 caused a significant demise of the state's power in the region, which led to the re-emergence of this old patrimonial, sectarian or trans jihadi identities. And please do not get me wrong. I'm not proposing a Hobbesian, anarchical system where you have a law enforcement from above. I'm just saying that with lack of state's power, you often have this new actors emerge in the society to establish some sort of order. Of course, equally important, following the Arab uprising, the sovereignty of Arab states, several Arab states, was put in danger. In the failed states, such as Yemen, Somalia, Sudan, and Syria, the states no longer exercise, this legitimate use of force in some areas. What we call it, this, the de facto sovereignty in the literature, right? Also, these states face severe financial constraints, near crash of the monetary system, and the collapse of the institutional and administrative apparatus, which undermines two complementary element of a successful nation state, right? That is, economic independence and self-sustaining. Yeah. Within this chaotic situation, came the pandemic, which added, another layer to the already existing crisis of security and lack of state's power. Today, the region faces, multi-layer cumulative crises, which bring back, the importance of those local actors in, playing or mitigating peace and conflict dynamics. And of course, in the case of today's talk, is mitigating COVID-19. Apart from a few humanitarian reports by WHO and others, there is little research has been conducted in general about how local actors affected by or responded to the pandemic in the conflict areas. Today's talk aims to fill this gap, and this is the novelty of today's talk. It will offer this insights on how COVID-19 is affecting peace and conflict trends in specific regions in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. And of course, the talk will be particularly around issues of trust and social cohesion and how those local actors are shaping the response to the pandemic. So the scope, as you can see, of the talk is very narrow, which makes it even more important, I think. We've been told that the narrower the scope of the research is, the sharper is the analysis. So I'm very much looking forward to today's talk, and I hope you will do too. We will be having 3 speakers, 2 case studies. At first, we'll be having Dr. Jolene Bourgeois, who will discuss how the pandemic has affected political trust and social cohesion in the north and west of Syria and the Kurdistan region of Iraq. Julien Bourgeois is a research associate at the Political Settlement Research Program at Durham University. Her research focuses on local conflict management and trust building in Lebanon, Iraq, and Syria. She received her PhD from Durham University, where she was awarded Al-Sabah Doctoral Fellowship and acted as member of EHRC Open World Research Initiative. She's also co-editor and co-contributor of the volume Syrian Crisis, Syrian Refugees, Voices from Jordan and Lebanon. And most recently, she co-authored also a book on Islam titled Islam, ISIS, and Fragmented State, the Challenges of Political Islam in the MENA region. And then we will hand it over to Robert Wilson and Rayman Al-Hammadi, who will both discuss how local actors in Yemen responded to COVID-19, examining how security actors reinforcing COVID measures in Taz city in particular, and of course the societal responses to these measures. Robert Wilson himself is also an associate researcher at the Political Settlement Research Program. His research focuses on peace processes and local governance in Yemen. Rayman Al-Hammadi is a visiting fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, and also a researcher at the Yemen Policy Center and ARK group. His academic and professional work focuses on the issues of security development in MENA region in particular. So without further ado, I'll pass it to Julien. Before that, just to let you know that the session will be recorded, but the discussion won't be recorded. Just bear in mind. And we will give each of the case studies 15 minutes. So 15 minutes to Julien and 15 minutes to Robert and Rayman. And then after that, we'll open up for Q&A session. I kindly ask you to stay muted, and if you have any questions, just post it on the chat room, and we will follow your question. And please, if you have question, keep it sharp, short, and if possible, give the name of the speakers that you would like to hear your answer from. So without further ado, I will pass it to Dr. Bourgeois to discuss her presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Amjad. Hello, everyone. I cannot see you, but it's nice to have you all here for that great event. Thank you, Amjad, for setting up the scene so well. It's true, my presentation will outline initial findings of two research projects I conducted in Kurdistan region, Iraq, in KRI, and in the opposition-held areas in northwest Syria. And as Amjad explained a bit, those two areas are highly fragmented. There is a lack of the presence of the state or the legitimacy of the state, ethno-religious diversity, but also a factionalism, international influence, and a high degree of local specificities. But those two areas also witnessed cycles of violence and protracted conflicts, which resulted in an atmosphere of complete mistrust, lack of cooperation between actors. And because of their history and fragilities, one could have expected that Iraqi and Syrian societies in the areas under study would be particularly vulnerable to the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. And that is what I try to examine. So whether the pandemic, which does not discriminate by community or geographical identity, overcame or exacerbated divisions and mistrust. So in other words, if we imagine a spectrum of political and social relations, did the COVID-19 pandemic put the cursor closer to conflict or peace? And I conducted this project in collaborations with colleagues in KRI and Northwest Syria from April 2020 last year, and it is still ongoing in Syria at least. Of course, we had to adjust our methods to accommodate the new realities brought by the COVID-19 pandemic. In these efforts, we are supported by the FCDO-funded PSRP and COVID Collective Research Platform. In Kurdistan, colleagues at the Open Think Tank, the OTT, and I designed a an online survey, which was answered by almost 1,000 respondents across the 3 governorates of the KRI, which are Duhok, Erbil, and Slimani. And I was also lucky, I want to say, to be there for 5 months between March and August last year during the first wave of confinement in Europe and in the MENA. So it gave me quite, a good amount of time also to observe what was going on there. In Syria, of course, access was completely impossible, and I was again very lucky to be able to rely on colleagues based in Amman and Azaz. And together we conducted about 60 interviews, mostly via phone. And we also shared an online survey, which was answered by close to 50 people in Idlib and Aleppo governorates, so the opposition-held areas. So what I would like to do during this less than 15 minutes now, I would like to present initial findings of this research project, and then I will conclude by suggesting some avenues for research and policy-oriented action. So first of all, I would like to offer insights on the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on the social cohesion. That is the relation between individuals, institutions, and the community, or communities in the case of KRI and Northwest Syria. I will focus more specifically on 2 important factors of social cohesion, which are social capital and trust. I would like to mention that this is not a comparative case study, right? So the presentation highlights quite different findings, even though in some occasions I would outline common dynamics that I think will also echo what Rob and Rayman will present in the case of Taiz in Yemen. So let's focus on KRI. First of all, the Kurdistan regional government took very early preventive measures to contain the spread of the virus. Kurdish borders were fully closed with its neighbors, with Iran, for example, in February, with Syria on the 1st of March, with Turkey in February 2020, and even with the rest of Iraq by mid-March. A complete lockdown was imposed also in mid-March, with movement restrictions between and inside governorates, and of course the ban of land and air travel. Later on, governors were given decision powers in terms of, for example, religious ceremonies, activities, travel between provinces, and other COVID-related policy. So it was quite clear from the beginning who was dealing with the COVID-19 file, and the discourse was rather united and clear. And as a result, the great majority of respondents, they really strongly supported the measures imposed in the KRI by the KRG to mitigate the impact of the virus. They also, initially at least, took the virus very seriously, and they adopted a new set of behaviors to prevent the spread of the pandemic. And as the pandemic threatened the whole Kurdistani population, indiscriminately, social cohesion has been reinforced both inside and in between communities in the KRI. I refer, for example, to solidarity movements such as food basket distributions to the most vulnerable, great care between family members and neighbors, but also very positive and helpful behaviors from the Peshmerga forces, which were tasked to implement movement restrictions in the KRI. And what I observed is that the institutions responsible for mitigating the impact of the pandemic attracted the highest level of trust across governorates. This is the case of the KRG Ministry of Health, but also the Ministry of Interior, including the security forces and the police. But conversely, participants expressed a very strong rejection of both parliaments that sit in Baghdad and in Erbil. I'll explain that a bit further if you wish during the Q&A session. And in fact, the results of the survey highlight a twofold division in the KRI. First, a quasi absence of trust in the federal government and institutions in Baghdad. Second, a political rift between the 2 main political parties in the KRI, which are KDP and PUK. They are controlled by the 2 main clans in KRI, and they really reflect the divisions within the Kurdistani society more widely. And notably, trust in the KRI president and prime minister, who are affiliated to KDP, was very highly contested in the Slimani governorate, which is historically more affiliated with the PUK, so the other main political party. And in Slimani, we observed that local distrust and dissatisfaction in the political institutions of the KRI was really apparent across the surveyed data. The rejection of Baghdad's rule, the social divisions inside KRI, along with political affiliations, but also the financial uncertainty facing the youngest Kurdistanis during the pandemic, they have been reinforced ever since last year. And so while COVID-19 has been met by social calm and order and showed a good level of trust and satisfaction with existing institutions in the KRI generally, well, the virus, the pandemic might also well reinforce existing vulnerabilities and grievances, which could then be factors of further fragmentation and conflict, both between the federal and the regional governments and within the KRI. So I will stop here for Kurdistan, and we will now travel, well, not too far really, in northwest Syria, where the research shows very different dynamics. The existing distrust in conflict actors that resulted from a lack of governmental capabilities, corruption, and years of unnamed violence, they were only reinforced by the pandemic. For example, the Salvation and the interim governments, here again, I'm happy to explain later, they competed over the COVID-19 file, and it really became a political issue because handling the COVID-19 policy in opposition-held areas meant cooperating with the international community and thus gaining international recognition and legitimacy. And in the end, this did not happen. The international community chose to work directly with the health governorate in Idlib, which is independent politically, and with the local civil society, more specifically the civil defense or the white helmets. The COVID-19 pandemic actually became even more politicized when President Bashar al-Assad thought that his government should handle COVID-related policies in all Syrian, including opposition-held areas. So this meant closing all border crossings with Turkey so that no aid and intervention could actually reach the northwest without transiting through areas under the control of the Syrian government. So what happened is that al-Assad's ally at the UN Security Council, Russia, used its veto rights, but it was countered by the UK, Germany, and France, who lobbied for Al-Bab crossing to remain open between opposition-held areas and Turkey, which is what happened eventually. And that's also why Turkey assumed a key role in mitigating the impact of the virus in the northwest of Syria. So what we're seeing here is that the virus had an impact on local politics and gave an unprecedented role to non-governmental actors, the civil society mainly, which substituted actors normally in charge of service delivery. But of course, the competition over the COVID-19 file resulted in the multiplication and inconsistency of the discourse, and this had mainly three consequences. First of all, Syrians in opposition-held areas relied mostly on social media and their family circles to keep informed about the evolution of the virus and mitigating measures. Official channels that were or affiliated to conflict actors were not trusted and remain untrusted until today. This contributed to the second consequence, which is that the bulk of respondents perceived the pandemic as a conspiracy and they would not adopt mitigating measures. We really saw recklessness in the response, the social response to the virus. And third and last, while there was a clear accountability of the state in the KRI, the lack of it in northwest Syria pushed respondents to rely mostly, again, on the civil society and their close circles for support. And as such, if cohesion increased within communities, it actually reinforced the lack of interaction and trust between them. For example, between the locals and the IDPs, or between inhabitants and political and military institutions, right? We can speak of established institutions, of course. So across the people we talked to during the research, about 75% had little or no trust in either of the governments, so Salvation and interim governments, or in the armed groups. Interestingly, the perceptions were actually more nuanced when it comes to the Turkish government, because Turkey was an essential channel for aid, need analysis, material, to reach opposition-held areas. And through its cooperation with local councils mainly, it actually it was able to impose stricter measures in the areas controlled by the interim government compared to Idlib government, for instance, and people really valued that. But maybe most interestingly, CSOs assumed a central role and they gained a lot of trust during the pandemic. For example, 90% of respondents put a lot of trust in local CEOs. In early April 2020, so about a year ago, the Health Directorate in Idlib and the Civil Defense, they launched the Initiative of Volunteers Against Corona, which is an intersectoral operation room initially composed of around 50 local organizations and 600 volunteers. Sorry. And we saw a real impulse for collaboration and coordination during the COVID-19 crisis in Northwest Syria. I give you an example. So there was this organization receiving funding to distribute face masks. And instead of going to the market and to just sell the stock they had received, they went to another organization which implemented vocational training for women to sew in a factory. And they paid these women to produce small masks based on the models that they received. The first organization also went to the Syrian Civil Defense and to the Idlib Health Directorate to receive health and security feedback for quality control of the products they were distributing and on the distribution itself. So in the words of several volunteers in Northwest Syria, before the COVID crisis, Syrian CSOs were forced to cooperate by donors, but it became quite natural and proactive during the COVID-19 pandemic. The civil society also tried to foster social cohesion between grassroots communities. For example, these are just examples, there are many more, right? But first line health workers and their families were sent food baskets. CSOs also created a special uniform for street cleaners to protect them, but also to allow them to go out easily during the confinement without being stopped, for example. So CSOs, they also put really a great effort in explaining to grassroots communities, for example, why such person was considered most vulnerable and should receive a special support to mitigate potential tension. That was especially the case between residents and IDPs. So this is about it for initial findings. Now very quickly, because I think I'm running out of time, I'm going to highlight avenues for research and policy-oriented action. So the first one is the changing role of the local civil society as a key actor of conflict management and peace building. In Syria, particularly, the civil society took on the role to deliver services, care for vulnerable communities, and to mitigate potential tensions during the COVID-19 pandemic. This is not an isolated case. For instance, the local civil society assumed a central role to mitigate the impact of the Syrian refugee crisis in Lebanon. And so grassroots initiatives of the local civil society, we really see that they prove to be more inclusive, more sustainable than sometimes they're qualified as inadequate aid distribution by the international community. Second, the delivery of a coherent and consistent discourse by the actors and institutions that enjoy the greatest amount of trust or confidence from local communities is key. This is notably the case we saw in Iraq and in Syria of health officials, local representatives also, for example, local council. Third, it's not new, but the study of the impact of COVID-19 on KRI and Northwest Syria reaffirms the need to empower local actors, political, civil society, and their capacities to build bridges on the horizontal and the vertical levels. That is, on the one hand, between the local level and the more national, international level, but also on the other hand, between grassroots, military, political actors. And finally, while the COVID-19 did not have the disastrous immediate impacts that many feared, it is crucial to dedicate efforts to mitigate the long-term repercussion of the pandemic. That is mainly the impact on education and the economy. And I personally think that these two factors, which often pre-exist the pandemic, of course, especially in conflict-affected areas, they will surely reinforce the vulnerability communities to violence in general, and I think to violent extremism more precisely, especially in Syria and Iraq. So this is it. I would like to mention that more detailed insights on those research are available in several reports and initial blogs findings. Yesterday also we launched the Local Voices at a Crossroads section on the CPPS website. It will feature insights from local actors of everyday peace who lie at the intersection between local realities and national peace building policies and practices. I think that Alison will very kindly put all the links to those first outputs. So please do visit these pages and don't hesitate to contact me if you have any questions or comments. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Julien. It's fascinating to see the difference from one case to another. The KRG, where when you expect that if there is a sort of state order, then mitigating pandemics would be easier, and social cohesion would be easier. In the case of Western Syria, it shows that reminds me of Gellner's famous quote. He said, crisis actually could possibly engender or encourages social cohesion, and government usually destroy it. Fascinating. Thank you very much. I'll pass it now to Robert and Ryman. You have 15 minutes. You divide it the way you wish, and then we will take it from there. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Len. So thanks, Julien. So I think I'd just like to start quickly by giving thanks to Yemen Polling Center and to Yemen Policy Center, who with Rayman have kind of been invaluable on leading on data collection and writing for this first part in ties so far. So the research was designed between the Yemen Policy Center and PSRP, and data has been collected by Yemen Polling Center. And I think it's important to say that this is part of a partnership between PSRP, Yemen Policy Center, and Yemen Polling Center as they carry out their civic politics project, which is funded by the German Federal Foreign Office. So I think slightly different to Julien's research so far, we're in very early stages of data collection and analysis in Yemen at the moment. So I think just before I offer any insights in line with Julien's points, it would be worth saying that at this stage, we are still in the process of analysing the findings in ties. And so noting that nothing being said in regard to Yemen today is conclusive, and these are early insights, as I mentioned. So we would ask that people don't discuss our findings outside of this event, as reports on this are forthcoming as well. So briefly, just the research in part 1 of our project, and there are going to be parts 2 and 3 which you can find information about on the PSRP website and on the Yemen Policy website. So part 1 of our project aims to understand the relationships between people in ties and police and security actors, specifically examining whether the arrival of COVID and the related measures have changed that social interaction. And I think for any of you that know Yemen, ties has been an extremely complex and heavily contested space, a city throughout the conflict. And so in such a complex setting, where we've seen a number of official state aligned and non-official armed actors interacting with each other, they all influence local governance in some ways, both inside the city and across the governance. So in that sense, we just wanted to understand how this plays into public perceptions around policing of new COVID measures. As Amjad mentioned at the start, helpfully, these are just another set of pressures playing into already very difficult settings in the Middle East and particularly in Yemen. And it'd be worth saying as well that Yemen Polling Center actually carried out a study in 2019 of policing systems in ties, and what they found was that some police and security actors in the city were providing both public service and security whilst also engaging in criminal activity and armed engagement. So just before I go into the data, Rayman, do you want to come in with anything, or are you happy?
No, I'm happy to go on, and then I'll come. I think you've said everything very well, and thank you so much for obviously giving credit where credit is due. But so far, so good. Okay, great. Yeah, so I'll just move on. So to touch on one of Julien's insights from Syria then, I think the early suggestions from our new data are that more than half of their participants felt that since the arrival of COVID, the effectiveness of policing hasn't improved.
and with the majority also answering that the level of public confidence in policing also hasn't really changed from the level that we'd seen prior to COVID arriving. And I think alongside this, in our data, we have seen a lot of phrases like confusion, corruption, or lack of planning, which generally relates to the implementation of COVID measures by authorities. It would be important to say that sometimes that's in general. So it's not just security actors, but it's also public health institutions as the definition of authority. And of course, as mentioned, we have to view this in the context of the pre-existing conflict setting, which already involved a fairly problematic relationship between police and the civic body. So I think naturally with any of the data, and particularly in Yemen, we have to try and position that relationship and any new COVID-related policing measures within the wider pressure sets that are already there and have been created by the conflict, which is now going on 6 years. So for example, we found that most participants suggested that overall compliance with COVID measures was only around about 20%. And that, I suppose, involves being asked to stay at home and follow the standard measures. And partly this relates to the reality that people have to leave the house to secure basic goods or even a daily wage, and of course health supplies are low. So possibly what we begin to see is these kind of pre-existing conflict pressures creating a need for people to secure basic resources, and that then begins to intersect with this disconnection between police, their intent to enforce the measures, and the public perceptions around the new measures. And an example that we've seen coming up a lot in the data is actually around how police have physically managed public spaces in ties. So invariably, people have to be able to go to markets to secure basic goods, which are already in short supply, given that the city has been under a sustained level of pressure given to due to conflict. So many of the answers that we found in the interviews focused on police efforts to close public spaces like markets or mosques, but then also suggested that police were not actually seen to be really upholding those closures or enforcing the measures, and they generally didn't last. And then people had to return to the space to kind of secure those basic services. And I think in some senses, there's also answers in the data that suggest this is actually supported by people, this approach by police, because there is this need to access goods at markets, and markets are generally the place that people have to go. But equally, there is another layer to this in the data where another common answer from participants regarding COVID measures affecting their access to basic services and resources saw this answer or this theme coming up frequently, which suggested that merchants were seizing food and medical supplies or PPE and sanitizers to profit on them. So I think the issue with that then is that there needs to be an enforcement control in the market space, in the sense that in one sense it appears this is particularly important, given that in the answers there was also a general sentiment across participants that measures should be more firmly enforced on the ground, or that they need to be more directed towards people. And if you view that with the other finding that we find in the data, which is that another theme that tended to come up, which was that police presence at markets and mosques is very high, then there does seem to be a question over if the police presence is high in these public spaces, even if they're not managing to remain closed, is there a disconnect as to why police are not enforcing that around access to key goods, especially with the pandemic, and distribution issues with merchants? So I'll quickly give Raymond a chance if he wants to jump in with anything or on anything I've said so far.
Yeah, no, pretty good. I think all what you said really hits it, and I just think in one point generally is that examining the outbreak in Yemen, or the pandemic outbreak, and seeing how people are responding to it. I mean, it's sort of what we see from the respondents is that there was obviously a big chance to work together at the beginning between local actors and the police, and sort of create a more harmonious social contract for a city that is devastated. But then from the research also, we find out that, obviously people get all these ideas, they plan to cooperate and such, but they're lacking the capacity, the resources, and the support that's required. And it was kind of like, obviously when you get interviews and you get data like that, you imagine that you still have to do some sort of context, or, but you have to do your research, you have to look at some secondary resources before doing so. But we were pretty pleased by the respondents' openness and sort of their own narrative, and sort of just, it gives hope that, the city will recover. It just needs to have certain factors get out, and whether it's like looking at the corona outbreak, which we've studied, but essentially just saying that, and people are people, and our interviews have basically given us that chance to see that indeed we can address some things in TAS if certain things allow. And yeah, that's it.
I think, yeah, just to pick up on that point, I think, like Rayman says, I think the assumptions that we make around a social contract that exists when something like this happens, it's quite important to understand that condition that was already existing in Yemen prior to the arrival of this. And I think there is positive aspects coming out of the data as well. So with that said, the high police presence at markets does seem to be centered around the fact that they're leading awareness raising campaigns from these areas, precisely because they still remain as busy sort of urban spaces. And this type of measure by police is referred to in the data as field campaigns, and it's generally being referred to in quite a positive way. And these are run by police in line with the orders of public health bodies, and it involves house-to-house visits, awareness raising through police use of social media and loudspeaker announcements, and so on, and then also posters and circulations in these spaces. So generally there was a consensus across answers that these were effective and fairly well received. So in terms of just a final point in terms of policing different types of space in line with the arrival of COVID, something I picked up and I just wanted to mention is on checkpoints, and there's a fairly high number of participants, at least a few suggesting that naturally health workers have to be tied into checkpoints now in order to carry out temperature checks on people arriving to the city. And through this, what we're seeing alongside this is suggestions that while you're seeing more checkpoints being set up to handle arrivals to the city, which of course is understandable, what you're also seeing is no effective implementation measures around supporting people to quarantine if they do show a high temperature or test positive. And I think that's seen alongside other suggestions of health workers, again, not having enough equipment at checkpoints. So this is where you see a crossover of sustained pressures where, you can try and enforce a measure, but it requires health resources, it requires financial resources. As Amjad mentioned at the start, Yemen's currency has been a real issue in the last few years. So these things all play into how these measures are policed and how they're received. So I think given the complex and contentious history between armed actors around checkpoints, though, I do think, especially in ties, checkpoints have been used for numerous functions in the conflict, and so maybe that's something that's worth examining a little bit further. And I think finally then, just before I go into what we'll call, given that we're in the early stages of data collection, we'll call them areas of focus rather than policy recommendations or such. I'll just touch on one final point which relates to Julien's themes, which is groups within society or fragments in regard to CSOs taking on additional roles to care for other groups within society as institutions are less able to provide service. And we have seen that coming out in our data as well. And one of the interesting things that we saw was a number of participants suggested that health resources coming from public institutions to vulnerable groups such as disabled people or IDPs was fairly low, almost non-existent. So that left CSOs to kind of source resources for those groups and to pick that pressure up. So it does seem to tie in with one of the final general findings across the answers, which was interesting, which is that most participants agreed that confidence in all institutions, as I mentioned, security and non-security, was fairly low prior to COVID arriving. But generally, confidence seems to be higher in CSOs and health institutions aligned with them. And that's generally because the public health office work in line with CSOs, and the CSOs are viewed, I think, generally as being closer to the people at the grassroots level. So I'll just quickly go on to finish, and two areas that I would suggest that could be areas of focus would be, firstly, to understand why there seems to be some inconsistency in how different spaces are policed in the city, some more heavily than others, but looking at more detail as to what the reasons for that are, and is that to do with conflict pressures or shortage of resources? And then I think another one for me would be find ways to engage non-security local actors like CSOs in providing their perceptions of the current policing and governance system in a city like Ties, because it seems clear that they hold confidence among people at the grassroots level and are viewed as actually being quite influential with public health bodies. So I'll leave it there and I'll pass to Rayman for any further areas of focus, and then I think we'd be finished there. So thanks.
Yeah, I actually don't have anything to add, Rob. I think you did such a good job explaining that. What I think I'll do is that, I mean, I guess a lot of us are obviously studying the Middle East and looking at what is described as the Orient, but the collaboration that PSARP and the Yemen Policy Center has proved to be, I guess, so fruitful. And I guess just as a sort of a side point, and really not really related to the research, but related to research in general, is that, obviously that, there's a lot of criticism of, Western institutions trying to study the Middle East or the Orient or so forth. But I completely disregard these, because had I not come up with the questions with Rob and worked on this tool collectively, for instance, I don't think we would have been able to develop this sort of framework and been able to align the methodologies and sort of just, the nuances that I knew about Yemen and the nuances that he knew about research ethics in general. And just sort of, I just recommend that these sort of collaborations sort of continue. And for that, I have nothing else to add, Rob. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for this very nice remark of you, Raymond, and Robert. Thank you very much as well. I wish you all the best with the research, and look forward to read the finding. And thank you very much, Robert, for emphasizing that those initial findings should not be shared. Raymond, it says in the old philosophy that the best man is the best human beings is all human beings put together. So I think you touched upon this. So I'll without further ado, I'll open up for Q&A session. If you have any question, just post it on the chat. Keep it short, and if you have like a specific speaker you would like him or her to answer, just mention that, please. Comments, maybe?